There we go. And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another victorious episode of the Assembly Call. As tonight, Indiana moves to 2-0, beating an NCAA tournament team from last year by the final score of 83-64. It was, of course, the return of Mike Davis to Assembly Hall, and that's probably the place to start for tonight's show. I spoke on our last show and on Twitter many times about my hope that Coach Davis would get a long and loud ovation upon his return to the Assembly Hall, and obviously we didn't see that for those of us who watched on the Big Ten Network, but from all Twitter reports that I saw before the game, that's exactly what happened. And obviously it was a late arriving crowd because of the early start and early in the week and all of those different things, but it sounds like he was well received, which is wonderful. And just great to see because he deserved it, and perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit later tonight. But, of course, once that was done, it was time to play a game. And it was an important game for Indiana because coming up Thursday is a game at home against SMU, a top 25 team, which represents one of Indiana's only opportunities to get a big signature win in the non-conference schedule. So that's going to be a very important game. And it was important for Indiana to play well tonight as kind of a tune-up for that game. And we're going to talk about that tonight on the Assembly Call. I, of course, am your host, Jerod Morris. Ryan Phillips will not be joining us tonight. Andy Bottoms may be here in about a half hour. But I do have a very special guest, Galen Clavio from Crimson Cast, who will be here. And we are going to get his thoughts on this IU game here in a moment. To start out, as we always do, we'll go with tonight's banner moment. And for me, it came early in the first half, actually. The Hoosiers, it was a relatively even game early on, 6-6 after the first TV timeout. And Indiana really used a 13-4 run there in the first half to extend things out to about a double-digit lead. And really from there, it never got below that. Indiana really never extended it way beyond that, but it never got below that. And I thought there was a 3-possession stretch for Hunter Perea that really showed the evolution of his offensive game. And if you're a regular listener, viewer of the Assembly Call, you know that I've been talking a lot about Hunter early in the preseason, and I realize that the competition isn't great. But the fact remains that we haven't really seen Hunter play well consistently against any level of competition. So even though these games early are coming against competition that isn't as great, we have to see him do it against the Mississippi Valley States and Texas Southerns of the world before we can ever expect him to do it in Big Ten season. Or in Big Ten play, and I thought there was a stretch of 3 straight offensive possessions that showed the evolution of his game because he scored 3 different ways. One was posting up, getting the ball with his back to the basket, and he made a nice up and under move. Another was on a pick and roll where he rolled to the basket and scored on a nice layup. I believe Robert Johnson threw that one. And the other was on a 15-foot jump shot that he made from, I believe it was from the right wing, or the right baseline. And now, within that stretch, it was really only a net 4-point stretch because he got out of position on a defensive rotation and gave up a layup. So it wasn't a perfect stretch. But I thought those 3 possessions showed the evolution of what Hunter is able to do on offense. And, we saw some turnovers tonight. It wasn't a perfect effort, and we'll talk about some of the block shots in the defense later. But I was at least encouraged that against real, live competition, he was able to do some things offensively that give me some hope that as the competition continues to get better, he will be able to play at a level that Indiana needs him to be competitive because we know how good this team's guards are, but clearly Hunter being consistent on a game-in, game-out basis, being able to give us something on both ends of the floor is going to be very important for this team if Indiana has any hopes of competing in the Big Ten, making a return to the NCAA tournament. With that said, I will now turn it over to my co-host tonight, Galen Clavio, and get his initial thoughts on tonight's IU victory. Galen, first of all, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jerod.
Of course, yeah. And let's get your thoughts on tonight's game.
Okay, well, look, I think let me start off by saying that you win a game by 19, 20 points. That's a pretty good night, regardless. This is obviously a better team than they played last week when they beat Mississippi Valley State. I mean, they're a much better coached team. Texas Southern had a lot of holes they had to fill. I think, as I heard on the broadcast, they lost 6 of their top 8 scorers from last year, so they're still kind of putting things together. But it's obvious they have a veteran coach who knew what he wanted to do against this IU team. He tried to slow the tempo down, and he did. And he tried to get IU into an uncomfortable situation, at least on the defensive end, and it didn't really work, particularly in that first half. I thought Robert Johnson, had the sort of game you really want to see out of a freshman. He seemed fearless with the basketball, both on the perimeter and driving to the basket, and I think that's going to be big. A lot of people have been wondering what exactly we're going to get out of Robert Johnson, and if this game is an indication of what he can do, then I think that's definitely a positive for this team. I think you made some really good points about Honor. I feel bad for Honor to a degree because we know he didn't get to play much last year. He didn't play at all the previous year, and he's being asked to do something that, frankly, he may not be capable of doing over the course of a full season. And I think you're right. It's a very incremental process. I thought his first half was pretty sketchy. I mean, he would have flashes of brilliance and then 2 or 3 possessions where he just looked lost on both ends of the floor. And I thought he did a really good job of shoring up his game, mostly on the offensive end, but also on the defensive end with the blocks in the second half. And by the end of the game, he was like, okay, we could see this guy playing in the post. Obviously it came against players who were primarily shorter than he was, and so you do wonder how he's going to deal with larger players like he'll face on Thursday. But for this particular setup, I don't know that you could have asked a whole lot more. And overall, I was disappointed that the team did not continue the offensive approach and pace that they had in the first half. It was a bit of a slog there in the second half. And it's hard to tell whether that's a byproduct of the team just being young and hitting a lull, or whether that was Texas Southern being able to throw a wrench in what they were doing offensively. But, overall, you wanted to have a victory that wasn't in doubt down the stretch, and I'd say they pretty much accomplished that. The lead never got below 10. And, going into the SMU game, it's almost good that they had to deal with a little bit of adversity, rather than just coasting through with another 35 or 40-point victory and not really learning a whole lot about themselves.
Before we talk about some of the individual performances, and certainly we want to analyze what Robert Johnson and what James Blackman Jr. did tonight, let's talk about, from a team perspective, we know that the big weaknesses for this IU team are rebounding and defense, especially interior defense. For the night, Texas Southern, the offensive rebounding percentage, the defensive rebounding percentage, those both went to Texas Southern. Their offensive rebounding percentage was 32.4. The defensive rebounding percentage was 75.9. Jim Jackson on the telecast, was talking at the end that, if Indiana can't out-rebound Texas Southern, what are they going to do when they get in the Big Ten, into Big Ten play against teams like Ohio State and the better teams on their schedule? And for some of the positives that I saw out of Honor on the offensive end, only coming up with 5 rebounds in a game like this is a bit concerning. He was out of position some, didn't get some rebounds that were available to him. On the positive side, the guards did a nice job getting rebounds. But part of that is because Honor wasn't getting some of the ones that he should have, and someone had to get the rebounds.
Yeah.
And another concern for me was that early in the game, I believe the first 4 baskets by Texas Southern were all point-blank layups. Indiana just gave up too many layups. Now, they shored that up some in the second half, in part because Honor became a human eraser, getting those 5 block shots. But I was disappointed early on with just some of the defensive awareness, the positioning, giving up too many layups. Again, if you're giving those up against a team like Texas Southern, what will you do against better competition? So before we get into talking about some of the individuals, these are going to be issues throughout the season, I think. We don't know much about this team, as Chronic Hoosier tweeted out at the end of the game. But we do know that the team can shoot well, which they did, but we also know this team struggles to rebound, and defensively it's a real work in progress. So let's analyze those 2 tough areas, because I don't think that I think that's going to be a theme as we go through the season.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a lot of this comes down, frankly, to youth. And, with youth, it's not just a matter of freshmen on the floor. Honor, despite this being his 3rd year in Bloomington, is still a young player in terms of actual minutes played. And, I think that there's a lack of attentiveness to detail when it comes to defense. And it wasn't just the point-blank layups at the very beginning of the game. It was also the wide-open spaces on the baseline that Texas Southern was finding, particularly when the zone was being played, but also even just in regular run of play, and that is concerning. And IU's fortunate right now because for the most part, they're playing teams that aren't going to really make them pay for those sorts of defensive lapses. And you just have to hope that in the few games against big competition that they have before Big Ten play starts, that they figure it out and they start closing down those mental lapses. I also think that from a collective standpoint, at some point people are going to stop cheating off of the shooters on the outside. And I think we saw that a lot with the open threes in the first half, where Texas Southern, because they were small, was so concerned about giving up interior baskets that they were dropping off of the three-point shooters and allowing them these wide open spaces. We saw Mississippi Valley State do the same thing. In the second half, they kind of stopped doing that to a certain degree, and the offense bogged down. And so figuring out what you do when people aren't helping off of your shooters, that's going to be another huge process of learning for this IU team.
So in the first two episodes, or I guess, first two, we've had four now with the exhibition games. We've spent a lot of time talking about Robert Johnson, talking about James Blackman Jr., analyzing Hunter Perea, kind of the shiny object syndrome that I think you can get into a lot with new seasons, where you look at the new guys. And I think to a certain extent, we have not talked as much about Yogi Ferrell as we probably should. Because at the end of the day, this team is going to go as far as Yogi leads it. And clearly Yogi can't mask deficiencies down low in some of those things, but he's still the most important player on this team. And so I want to make sure we talk about him some tonight, because he played 38 minutes tonight, which I don't think is necessarily what you want him playing in a game against a team like Texas Southern. But, he was out there. He had the best plus-minus on the team at 16. And I think we saw a lot of good and some of the bad from Yogi tonight. And here's what I mean by that. He had 20 points. He led the team in shots, was pretty efficient at 9 of 16. And despite playing off the ball a decent amount, because Robert Johnson and James Blackman Jr. were initiating the offense a lot, Yogi did have 7 assists and could have had more. He had a couple nice passes that weren't converted. Did a decent job on the glass, but also had 5 turnovers. And 2 of those in the first half were, I call them inexplicable, simply because to me, they're passes that I get Yogi making as a freshman. I don't see why he still makes them as a junior. Kind of an ill-advised alley-oop here, a behind-the-back dribble in traffic there that, they get stolen. Just the kind of turnovers that you don't need. I mean, we know this team is going to play fast. We know they want to play up-tempo, but there are careless turnovers that no matter how fast you're playing, really can't just be accepted. Those are turnovers that really shouldn't happen. And so I think when we talk about that leadership by example, if a big difference between this year's team and last year's team is taking care of the ball more, the guy who's setting tone, who will have the ball in his hands the most, Yogi, I think, needs to do a little better job of, making sure that the turnovers are, trying to make plays that have a decent chance of converting, and not the really low reward, high risk type turnovers that we're seeing. So I thought overall it was a good performance from Yogi. He was mostly efficient. He scored well. He did a lot of the different things that you want to see him do. But those turnovers, that's a little bit of a concern for me, simply because I think when the competition heats up, he's going to have the ball in his hands more, and I think we need to trust him a little bit more to make better decisions. What do you think of his play tonight?
Yeah, and I mean, I agree. I think overall he had a fine game. I thought that, the turnover thing is a bit of a concern. He had 5, I think he said 5 turnovers tonight. He had 3 turnovers against Mississippi Valley State. The thing that worries me is if the plan is to play more up-tempo with this team, and from all intents and from all indications, that's what Crean seems to want to do with this squad, you can't have Yogi leading the charge and making errant passes, because I think what we saw a lot in this game was this team does not handle transition defense particularly well when they're the ones playing the defense. And I think that those sorts of turnovers, the ones that you're referring to in particular, they kind of unsettle the offense. They make guys look a little bit frenetic, look like they're not sure where they're supposed to be. And you're right, there has to be a calming influence from Yogi with this very young squad, and particularly if you've got, Johnson and Blackman out there simultaneously, or if you're trying to get Honor into a particular place. It's hard to say whether that's something that we're really going to see calm down. I mean, look, last year, even though Yogi turned the ball over a decent amount, he actually got significantly better in terms of turnovers than he was his freshman year. I think he went from turning the ball over on almost a quarter of his possessions freshman year to only 18% last year. So that obviously represents a big jump. Now, he's going to have to be a lot better than that this year. I mean, a starting point guard on this particular type of team where every possession is going to be crucial because of potential defensive deficiencies, they can't afford to lose the ball early on in possessions. I mean, you make a pass towards the end of the possession and you end up coming away with a turnover. I mean, that happens. It's going to happen in any offense. But it's the early ones that really do concern me, where there's only 5 or 6 seconds that have gone off the shot clock. And I think the SMU game is going to be a really big indicator of that, because it's one thing to be turning the ball over 5 times against a Texas Southern team that frankly doesn't have a lot of athletes, and the turnovers are kind of unforced. I do worry about a situation where we start seeing potentially some forced turnovers, and I wonder how that manifests itself.
So we got a Twitter question here real quick from Wes Geyer, who asked us a lot of questions. We appreciate it, Wes. So what do you think about Yogi not playing at the point these last few games? Practically none this game. I don't know that I would say practically none. I mean, he still had the ball in his hands a lot, but you certainly have seen Robert Johnson and James Blackman Jr. initiating the offense more. I think that can be a big positive for this team, because Yogi is such a good shooter that if he is able to find some more spot-up three-pointers instead of just, some of the step backs and the, pound off 3, 4, 5 dribble three-pointers, I think it can make him even more effective, more efficient. But I do think that once we start playing the tougher teams, the ball is going to be back in Yogi's hands. So I like in these exhibition games experimenting some, getting Robert, getting James, even getting some other guys, some experience initiating the offense. But ultimately, it's Yogi's team, and it's going to be him initiating the offense for the most part against the more difficult competition. Do you agree?
Oh, I agree. Hey, I don't agree that he hasn't really been playing point the last couple of games, but I do think there needs to be an effective second option at the point guard position that gets developed. And, if that's Robert Johnson or if that's James Blackman handling the ball, it has to be somebody that can find people. And I think having Yogi still on the floor while that person is also handling the ball can be a good thing, because, as you said, he's shown the ability to shoot from deep, and he shot such a huge proportion of the team's three-pointers last year that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for him to suddenly not be shooting those at all. I think it takes pressure off of the other shooters if he is able to get the ball off the ball. So, I'm very curious to see how they manage the talent in general on this squad, because you've got all of these players kind of jammed into the same position, and there's only 5 guys that can be on the floor at one time. I mean, we've seen now James Blackman Jr. having basically 2 good games, or a game and a half of a good game. He didn't have a very good first half today. We've seen Robert Johnson have a good game. Zeisloft looked pretty good the first game. At some point, you got to figure out, how do we get all these guys on the floor and give them meaningful minutes? And I think the idea that Yogi playing in a position other than point guard for 5-6 minutes at a time over the course of a game might help in that pursuit.
Let's break down some individuals, and let's talk about James, and let's talk about Robert. You're right. I mean, James obviously was very, very good, very consistent in that first game. Tonight it was really a tale of 2 halves for him, and really it was a tale of 2 halves for Robert Johnson. I mean, Robert came out and was just absolutely out of his mind in the first half. He had 17 points. He was 3 of 3 from downtown. He had 3 or 4 assists in the first half, I think 4 rebounds. And really, his offensive game in the first half reminded me of A.J. Guyton in terms of the different ways he scored. I mean, he was 3 for 3 from downtown. He had some nice hesitation dribbles, got into got some layups. Really, just a terrific all-around game. Mm-hmm. And James really struggled in the first half. Now, to his credit, on the one hand, you can say he didn't force it. But my point that I was making to some people on Twitter at halftime is, unfortunately, the way this team is constructed, James Blackman Jr. just kind of having an off night and not forcing it isn't going to be good enough. I mean, this team is going to need him to score 15 to 20 points a game because, as you said, of how it's constructed. They're not going to get much from down low. He's going to have to score. And I was extremely encouraged by what I saw from him in the second half, because I don't think he forced anything there in the first 10 minutes of the second half, and he put up 14, 15 points. I mean, made some threes, had a couple nice drives. It was all smooth, all within the offense. And it was great to see because a guy who scores that much, who has that kind of hype and even pressure on him early in his career, you could see him struggling in a second half like that, and he didn't. Now, Robert didn't play as great in the second half, but that was okay. I mean, I think, similarly, he didn't really force anything. Some of the shots he was making the first half missed. That's going to happen. But let's talk about these two guys because, I think, I mean, in terms of just a freshman backcourt coming in, there aren't many in IU history that are as good as these two guys. And unfortunately for them, or fortunately, I guess, depending on your perspective, they can't really be freshmen. Like, we need this kind of performance from them against even the better teams we play. And at least so far, we're learning that we can trust them to a certain extent, which is heartening for all IU fans, I think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, and kind of like you said with Hunter earlier, they have to do it against the small competition before they can do it against the big competition. And, I think you're right. This is a very talented duo, and we haven't really had a lot of talented freshman guard duos like that have just been able to come in and get that sort of playing time. Now, a lot of that's been because we've had really good guards historically at IU, and so even with a lot of talent, there tends to be a learning curve to get them in. So it's kind of a blessing and a curse at the same time. I do think that with these two, it's not really plausible for me to think that they're going to play to this level every night, and that's just from being freshmen. It has nothing to do with their talent level. It has everything to do with finding the consistency to do this in and game out for 30 games out of a season, particularly when you're going against bigger, stronger guys that can defend you effectively. But we've seen, they can both shoot the ball well. We knew that. We kind of knew just from having watched Blackman on the high school level and elsewhere that he has that mentality that he's going to be able to get his offensive game going one way or another. We weren't really sure about that with Johnson, and so far it does look positive. What I'm curious about is how does their play coincide with Stan Robinson's return? Do we see Robinson on the floor with just being interchanged with them and kind of almost having like a three-man rotation with one guy on the bench and two guys out there at any one time? Because it's going to be interesting. I think it's good. You want competition at the spots where you're going to see the basketball put into the hoop, and anything that can push one of these guys is going to push all of these guys simultaneously. So. I am really curious to see what happens in this SMU game, both because we'll see both Blackman and Robert Johnson against stronger competition, but also because we know Stan Robinson is going to be back on the bench and eligible to come into games at that point.
I am fascinated by Thursday night, in terms of what we're going to see, because number one, we haven't been given any indication. Troy Williams is a guy who was kind of penciled into that starting lineup from the beginning of the year. We have no real indication yet if he will be starting, or if he's going to have to earn that starting job back. Stan is a guy that we all kind of thought was going to be a sixth-man type. And obviously Colin Hartman is a guy who's been the first off the bench in these last few games and really done a nice job, and we'll get to him. It'll be interesting to see, again, when the competition level ratchets up, if Colin can continue to have that impact that he's had. But I am really curious to see what happens with the lineup, with the rotations when it comes to the SMU game. What I am even more interested to see, even more fascinated by, is the 2014-15 season debut of Andy Bottoms on the assembly call. And it does indeed look like we are going to get an Andy Bottoms appearance tonight because he has joined us on the Google Hangout. And that means we stop everything and say, hello, Andy, and welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, sir. What's going on?
What's happening? We're just talking a little IU basketball. What are you up to?
Not too much. The only good thing about the snow that we got here in Cincinnati today was that it canceled school and subsequently canceled my daughter's basketball practice, so I could actually sit and watch the entire game and join you two fine gentlemen. And so, if there's anything good to come with the weather, I think this is as best as I've come up with so far.
How has the season been going so far? What has your strategy been as a coach?
We have won both games so far, even though no one actually keeps score.
That's
My dad was at the game on Friday and kept score, and we scored 48 points in a 32-minute game with a running clock. So I feel like
Wow.
that was pretty good for first and second grade girls. So I don't know what that ends up being on a points per possession basis,
That's
but
some that's some Paul Westhead stuff right there, man.
Yeah.
Good lord.
yeah, we get the rebound and we run because it takes a while for everybody to get set back up. So we get a lot of transition baskets is our plan.
But how many points did you give up? That's the key.
Only 24 in that game.
All right.
Hold them up.
Very good. So Ken Pod
Solid-
ranking, you guys are number one in the
Solid
country.
solid defensive effort. Only man to man because that's all that's allowed. But somewhere Bob Knight is nodding his head in approval at 7 and 8-year-old girls playing man to man defense. So far it's been a successful season. We'll see. There's only 3 other teams in the league, so we've beaten 2 of them so far. We'll see how the other one is.
I know Galen right now is just getting ready to make a scheduling joke and talk about how Tom Crean wishes that he could schedule your team for a game.
No. His team shoots way too well to schedule.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're like the MEAC maybe, and the SWAC is more the IU speed, I'd say at this point.
All right. Well, Andy. It is great to have you on the show. We've missed you the past few episodes. So let's get your bottoms line. Give me your thoughts on this game, and then we'll get back into analyzing a few more individual performances, but then more importantly, looking forward, because ultimately we can only learn so much from these 2 games that we played so far, and the SMU games can tell us a lot.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I thought some of the same things that have been good. The outside shooting, the play of the freshman guys in the backcourt has been really good, but definitely, I think lackluster is probably as good a word to describe the second half as any, and really a game they couldn't. It never really felt in doubt, but also never really put Texas Southern away. And I thought that was, the one thing about Mississippi Valley State, for as poor as they were, they really showed what little killer instinct is needed to put somebody like that away. And I thought that was definitely, a case tonight where they just, whether it was a turnover or giving up easy baskets, things like that, just kind of let Texas Southern keep it close enough that, you had to leave a lot of the starters in there for a while. So I'm sure you guys have talked about the rebounding. I think that is Texas Southern not a big team at all, and for a large period of time, Perea had 0 defensive rebounds, which is astounding to me. Now, a couple of the times, he's out challenging 3-point shooters for reasons known only to him, and getting himself away from the basket. That's just something he can't afford to do. This team can't afford to do. And while it's easy to point to Troy Williams coming back as somebody who's going to solve that, his rebounding percentages weren't blown anybody away last year. So while he'll obviously help with that, depending on what kind of playing time he gets, which I'm sure if you haven't talked about yet, we'll probably start to get into some of those things. The rebounding continues to be a concern. I thought in spurts, again, I'll be curious to see how these bunch together as they seem to always do. The turnovers seem to kind of come in waves, and then some defensive breakdowns. And Texas Southern, I think at least at one point when I looked in the first half, they ended up 20 of 42 from 2-point range. I mean, teams are just gonna hammer IU in the paint, and there's no reason to do anything else. And SMU, as you start to look ahead, I was looking a little bit today. They don't take a lot of 3-pointers. They don't. That's just not a part of what they do. And in their first game, albeit against Lamar, who IU, who's so bad that is there, of course, on the upcoming non-conference schedule, they shot like 70% on 2-pointers against them. So, and even without Marcus Kennedy, who's their best big man who's out, they've still got a few very capable guys to dump the ball into inside. So I think those concerns that people probably had coming into the season, to me, got magnified a little bit tonight against a team that really doesn't have any kind of dominant low post threat. But I think something that continues to be a concern. And I'd be more apt to take my chances with a team that's pounding the ball inside than a team that's relying a lot on the 3-point shot, no matter how good IU shot it so far.
A couple more individuals that I want to get to real quick before we jump ahead. Nick Zeisloft, played really well the first or in the exhibition games. Has been a little bit up and down otherwise. And tonight, I thought for a while there was a little bit invisible. And actually, as I was about to tweet that, he got a great tap-out rebound on a free throw and made a 3. And then Justin Albers tweeted about, how he had really had a quietly good game, and I looked at the stat sheet, and he had 6 points, he had 6 boards, he had 2 steals, had only turned the ball over once, and really in his 32 minutes had actually, statistically done a nice job. And Zeisloft is a guy that I've had a real hard time figuring out what I expect from, because, some of the people who went on the Canada trip came back really high on him, and yet, you have to be grounded in the reality. This is a guy that went to Illinois State, didn't shoot particularly well last year. Galen, as you guys pointed out on your latest episode of Crimson Cast, actually shot better as a freshman, struggled shooting last year, and now a lot's kind of being expected of him this year. And I think tonight's performance is really what you hope from him as the season goes forward, which is not necessarily score. I don't remember what game it was that he scored 20-some points and was just out of his mind. He's not going to do that. But, making a few timely threes, grabbing rebounds, not turning the ball over, just doing solid Nick Zeisloft things like he did tonight, this is more, I think, the kind of game that is repeatable for him. If it maybe is the better word, which is I think what you're looking for from one of your upperclassmen. I mean, he's for better or worse one of your upperclassmen leaders. Galen and Andy, you two, give your thoughts on Zeisloft, because I'm still struggling with what to expect from him. But as I think about it more, this is the type of performance that I think should be expected, and if he can do it, is going to really help this team win some games.
I guess my expectations on Zeisloft are Matt Roth, if Matt Roth didn't have to be anchored to the three-point line all the time, which, I mean, all we saw was Matt Roth shooting threes when he was here, and that was mostly because he was one of the only outside threats that the team had for most of his existence in an IU uniform. I think Zeisloft is a step slow on defense, and I think it's going to be really hard to keep him on the floor against good offensive teams, or at least teams with athletic talent, because I just don't know that he's going to be able to keep up, particularly when you've also got Robert Johnson and Stan Robinson and other guys that you could have out on the floor in this place. And so he's going to have to, I think, probably play more of a supporting role. I don't think we're going to see him starting. I would be surprised if he ended up averaging more than 14 or 15 minutes per game. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. But I think that, the idea that he's going to be a regular factor out there for us, I've yet to see anything in the few times I've seen him in an IU uniform that would indicate to me that that's going to be the case. So I don't know. Maybe Andy's got a different take on it, but that's where I stand on him.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think when you look, this team, while somewhat out of necessity over these first couple of games, has had to play 4 guards a large period of time. Whether because Troy Williams is coming back and maybe whatever Emmett Holt can do, and just the level of competition, they're not going to be able to afford to do that. And certainly when you start to line up the guys that are playing that similar position and that similar size, he's at best 4th in the pecking order behind Yogi, Robert Johnson, and James Blackman, and so you figure that Robinson will have some role there, and that maybe that makes him 5th. And I just don't know, unless somebody gets into foul trouble, that you're going to play him significant minutes. And it isn't that he can't give you something off the bench, but is he really giving you that much more than a Colin Hartman is? And Hartman gives you another, 5 inches of height on the floor and a little bit better rebounder, and apparently a burgeoning shot blocker. So
3 block shots tonight, baby, for Colin Hartman.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I don't. When you start thinking about guys that you might play alongside those 3 guards, it becomes tougher to make a case for Zeisloft. And I don't think, to Galen's point, that's not really an indictment of him. I think it's just more what he is, and he's been able to do more and show some things. And I think there will be games he comes out in a similar way that Matt Roth did, and was a valuable guy and played 15, 20, maybe more minutes a game, depending on the game flow and what's going on. But I think night in and night out, that isn't going to be, and probably shouldn't be, the plan.
There are a couple ways to interact with the show. You can tweet us with the Assembly Call hashtag. You can also go to the YouTube page, and if you go to assemblycall.com/live, there's a link right there to the YouTube page, and you can participate in the chat there. And Matt All actually makes a good point here, and he says, to Galen's point about minutes, is this the poor man's version of Calipari's trouble in Lexington? And what he means by that is too many 3-star wings instead of too many 5-star McDonald's All-Americans. I think what he's getting at there, and again, what I really thought about today when I was listening to your guys' podcast is, what's interesting about this team is there's a lot of talent there. Like there's a lot of good individuals. Yogi Ferrell and James Blackman Jr. and Robert Johnson and obviously Troy's coming back and Stan Robinson. Like these guys can all do things individually, and even Honor is showing he can do some things individually. And Colin Hartman's played well, and shoot, even Max Hotzel had his moments in the first exhibition game where he looked pretty good. And the question is, and then you get an Emmett Holt back, and we don't really know what to expect from him. And the question is, can the sum, equal the parts? And you want obviously the whole to be even greater than the sum of the parts. And I wonder if we can get to that. And what's going to be hard is that there's a lot of guys, like you said, who play the same position. And how are the minutes distributed? And what are the lineup constructions that really end up working for this team? And I guess that leads me into talking about this SMU game. And Andy, let me go to you first with this, and then Galen, I'll get your perspective on it. We talked on the last episode about, not necessarily who would start the SMU game, because we don't know if Troy is going to be starting right away, but it's pretty clear that Yogi, Troy, and Honor were the guys coming into the season that were pretty much penciled in as starters. And you can add James Blackman Jr. to that, I think, even though he was a freshman. People still expected him to start. Those four, and then who would be the next guy, not only who would start, but more importantly, who would finish. And I think Robert Johnson has shown that he is, at least against lesser competition, we'll see how it translates, that he is capable of filling that role, and I think he has earned it with his consistent play. And then where does that leave everybody else? And so, Andy, let me go to you with that first. I mean, what do you think is this team's best five right now, and what do you kind of see as does Colin Hartman stay as the first guy off the bench? Like, what do you see right now based on what you've seen, and how do you kind of project that forward? Because that, to me, is the big mystery of this season, is which guys are you playing, which combinations work with such a weirdly constructed roster?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see how, I think Perea, for better or worse, I think we kind of got everything from him tonight. I'm sure he was one of the first guys you talked about that, in one stretch makes 3 great plays on offense, but is invisible on the defensive glass and has some turnover issues and just kind of the consistency that has plagued him, albeit in more limited minutes over the first couple years of his career. But there are clearly no other options for that position, and I'm not sure there's anybody more important to this team than him, and that is somewhat of a frightening revelation as we go forward. But so I think he's definitely there. I really don't see how you survive playing the 4 guards that they have extended minutes like they have. So to me, that likely means that Troy Williams is going to be in the starting lineup. I do think Hartman's a guy that needs to continue to be one of the first guys off the bench, because he's certainly done nothing to suggest that he doesn't deserve to get some of those minutes. And maybe it's a case where you play him and Troy together in parts to spell Perea, because, Priller came in tonight, and for as much as a, cult figure as he's becoming, committed 2 fouls in hardly any time at all. Jeremy April or whatever the hell we're calling him at this point is, there, but seems a ways away from really contributing. And Holt, I don't think any of us have any idea what we were going to get from him, let alone now, what his mental state might really be as he gets ready to come back. So I think Hartman has to continue to be a solid part of the rotation, because there are so many questions in the front court that even though what he's going to give you isn't going to blow you away, you have a pretty good idea what he's going to give you on any given night, which is more than you can say for most of the other front court options. And then I think, to the point earlier, then you're gonna see a lot of Robert Johnson, Blackman, and Yogi and Stan perhaps spelling them a bit, and I think that's a fine rotation to kind of weave your way through those guys. But I just, these, especially with a couple of the guards being a little bit smaller, I just don't know how those guys are going to be able to rebound. I mean, we saw it tonight again against a team that didn't have a lot of big guys. And SMU's got a few, 6'5", 6'6", pretty athletic wing guys who are going to be tough to keep off the glass as well. So you get into Big Ten play, I just don't think this team's going to survive playing 4 guards for anything more than, a minute at a time. So I guess that's what I would think it's gonna look like. I know when you guys had talked before about whether that sends a good or a bad message with Williams being able to come right back and step right into the starting lineup, but I also don't know that there's a ton of an alternative there unless you go with Hartman, at least initially, and kind of gradually move Williams back into that role. But I think that's how it shakes out eventually, whether it's against SMU or in a few games.
And Galen, what do you think? I mean, obviously that was a big concern for you guys on your preview show. Is just, you got all these players, but how's Tom Crean going to use them?
Well, there has to be a tighter rotation, and there has to be a more logical methodology of substitution than we've seen out of Crean, frankly, since he got here. I mean, he tends to throw guys out. There's always three guys at the scorer's bench waiting to come into the game, it seems like, and it's frustrating because it robs the team of a consistency that I think they desperately need on the floor if they're going to be successful. And I think that was one of the big problems that this team had last year, was that you never had the same lineup on the floor for more than a minute and a half, it would seem. So I think from a starting lineup perspective, I think right now it seems obvious that you roll with Yogi, Blackman, Robert Johnson, Troy Williams, and Honor. That has to be your starting five. I think you then have Stan Robinson and Colin Hartman as the two guys who get the lion's share of the minutes off the bench, and then Zeislov comes in when necessary. Hetzel comes in when necessary in the post, and I think you leave it at that for now. I mean, obviously when you've got some opportunities against some of the minnows on the schedule, you see what you get out of April, you see what you can get out of Emmett Holt. Maybe you see if Ryan Burton can handle the strain of playing D1 basketball at a consistent rate minutes-wise. But I think a lot of the problems that we're going to run into are if we're constantly rotating the fourth guard out there, or we end up with a situation where Pereira's on the bench and the tallest player on the floor is 6'6", for 4, 5, 6 minutes at a time. That's going to kill us against SMU when they can roll a 6'11" guy out there, a 6'10" guy out there, 2 6'8" guys. It's that sort of jumpiness in the lineup is not something I think we can afford with this team. I mean, obviously the height's going to be a concern, as Andy said. Obviously the rebounding is something that's worrisome, but I think you can counter that if you have consistency on the floor, if guys feel comfortable with where each other are on the floor and where they know my teammate's going to be in this position, my teammates are doing these things, therefore I can concentrate on this particular item. I think that would help this team out quite a bit.
You said something really scary there. You said Max Hetzel when needed in the post.
Well, who else at this point?
Well, I know, but it's a terrifying thought because he was billed as this three-point shooter, and now we're talking about him as a guy in the post. But the reality is, Tim Priller has been the backup for Hunter Mascara-Perea so far, and God love him, but Tim Priller's a guy who averaged fewer than 5 rebounds a game in high school, and he's that tall. He is a shooter. I mean, that the skill he brings to the team is outside shooting, right. And he's been playing down in the post. We don't know what to expect from Emmett Holt. I tweeted this earlier, and I found myself kind of daydreaming about it early in the second half. That if somehow this team can get 8 to 12 productive minutes out of Jeremiah April, it would be really big. And then before I was even done with the tweet, I was like, wait a minute. It's not that it would be big. Like, they almost have to. Like long term for this season to be successful, you almost need Jeremiah April to be a guy who comes in and develops into a solid guy, which, when you saw him play unexpectedly against Mississippi Valley State at the end, and he looked relatively fluid and hit a nice little turnaround jump shot, you can daydream as an IU fan that, hey, maybe he can be productive even as a freshman despite injuries and, not being highly ranked and all those different things which suggest he can't. But go ahead, Galen. Do you have a...
Well, I guess my concern, you're right, and I've, from what I'd heard of April's injury situation and the fact we didn't see him, I think, at all tonight, I'm not really counting on him to make a contribution until I see it happen over a 2 to 3 game span. But I guess what concerns me is all that we've heard all offseason is that this is a team of shooters, shooting. That's going to be our primary thing. That's going to be the huge difference on offense. Well, you can't keep shuttling shooters in and out of games constantly and expect them to be able to come out and just put the ball in the basket on demand, particularly against teams that have the athletes to defend on the perimeter. And so I guess I'm concerned that if we're running 10 guys in a rotation or 11 guys in a rotation, that's going to do more to harm ourselves on the offensive end than help ourselves on the defensive and rebounding side of the equation.
Andy, you analyze Tom Crean and his substitution patterns, which I know can be maddening and can make you want to hit your head against your computer, which is also a good time to remind people that you do that after every game and to get it on our email list at assemblycall.com/subscribe. Because even though it's frustrating to read, you want to read Andy's analysis of the plus minus and the substitutions because it makes you a smarter IU fan. So with that said, Andy, let me go to you because number one, is there anything kind of in Tom Crean's history or in, what you've been analyzing that suggests he will tighten the rotation at all? And do you think that's what's needed for this team that's going to rely so much on shooting and kind of rely on being in a rhythm on offense because we're going to have to outscore people?
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest this year's team, while more guard heavy than last year's, from a sure things perspective, feels a lot like last year's, and in that sense, you never really saw anything stabilize. You never really saw the rotation get shortened last season. So I would be hard pressed to say that that's something we should all of a sudden expect this year. Although I agree with Galen, I think it's going to be really important. I mean, you're going to have probably this year, you certainly have at least already identified what seems to be a core group of guys who are there, and I think you want to try to find a way to maximize the sure things outside of those guys. So at this point, the three guys I feel most comfortable with of what you're going to get on any given night that we've seen. So obviously that kind of takes Stan and Troy out of this. Is I think you got a pretty good idea. They may not combine for 60 points every night like they did tonight, but I think you got a pretty good idea what you're going to get when Yogi and Blackman and Robert Johnson step on the floor. And other than that, I would argue Hartman is the next guy that you have a good idea of what you're going to get from him. And even though that isn't going to knock your socks off, to me, that's one of the reasons that I'd play him. Is he's not going to kill you. He's not going to make ridiculous plays. He's not going to try to do too much, at least based on what we've seen so far. And I think that's what this team needs, and that's what last year's team needed too. And it never came. You can argue because the players, didn't get it together, but you can also argue because they never got the chance to. And so to me, outside of those guys, you got to, Perea to me is going to be in there for better or worse, and we're going to have to ride out the ups and downs that surely brings. But when you start looking at bench guys and other front court players, this team has to maximize guys who aren't going to make mistakes and are going to be consistent night in, night out. And that doesn't need to be consistently getting 8 points and 8 rebounds. It just needs to be, I'm putting this guy in. I know what I'm going to expect. He knows what his role is. He knows what to do. And I think the way that you drive that home is to shorten the rotation a little bit with some of these guys and get the team used to playing in certain combinations. And go from there. So I think it's necessary with this team in the same way that it was necessary last year, but unfortunately, history would suggest that seems unlikely, or at the very least, we're going to struggle to figure out what the pattern is of how that all shakes out.
So let me play devil's advocate here for a minute, because I think it's pretty easy to point out the flaws of this team, see the flaws, focus on them, and get down on the team. But the reality is also that there's a point guard who's in his third year who was an all-big player who is going to get a chance in the NBA someday. We don't know if Yogi's going to be a starter or a backup, but he'll play in the NBA someday, I think. James Blackman Jr. is a potential NBA player. Some people are even talking about him as a one-and-done. That's how talented he is. He's that good of a scorer. Troy Williams is a guy that people have even said, hey, if he makes a big jump as a junior, he could even go pro, or as a sophomore. Now, who knows about that, but he's clearly got the athletic talent. We saw flashes of it at the end of last season. Robert Johnson is showing himself to be a pretty good player. So I know the team has gaping holes inside, is going to struggle to rebound, is going to struggle to defend, but it seems like there's a whole lot of talent there in the backcourt and even on the wings that if those guys can play well enough, maybe you compensate over here. And so my question to you guys know the college basketball landscape a lot better than I do outside of IU. So forgive me for putting you on the spot here, but are there any recent comps for a team that is so loaded in the backcourt and on the wings, and so with kind of that gaping hole in the middle and even depth down low, that has been successful? Like what's the template that Indiana's going to follow if they're going to have a successful season and capitalize on their strengths? Galen, I'll go to you first if you have one. If not, I'll go to Andy. And maybe there isn't one. I mean, that's the thing. Like maybe,
I mean,
maybe that's
the template. Yeah, the template, I guess, is Marquette 2008. I mean, but that team had, Dominic James, which maybe that's a comp for Yogi. They had Jarrell McNeil, they had a Wes Matthews, they had Lazar Hayward, but that team had been coherent and good together for quite a while. I mean, that team, had gone to that was their third tournament in a row. They were a single-digit seed each of those 3 years, and I think. I mean, I'm sure there are other comps, and I can't think of any other ones right off the top of my head. I'll give it some more thought. Is it impossible that this team does well? No, I don't think so. And I think, I guess my biggest concern with the long-range forecast for this squad is we haven't seen them win on the road effectively, even when we had really good players that were in traditional positions. And we don't really know how the offense is going to work, relying so heavily on young players to do a lion's share of the scoring. And by that I mean, obviously James Blackman Jr. as a freshman, even if he's very good, is still going to have to carry a lot of the scoring burden. Hanner Mascara-Perea is going to have to carry a scoring burden just by virtue of being on the floor as much as he is. Those factors, I guess, are what worry me even more than the size issue. The size thing is obviously a huge factor, but just the youth of the team, I don't know if there's a comp that isn't full of McDonald's All-Americans a la Kentucky, where you're relying on so many underclassmen to carry such a big load.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, the one team that I was looking up as we were on here, I'm really glad you asked Galen that first because I would have just sat here in silence for about 30 seconds.
I tried to cover for you, Andy. I did the best I could there.
I appreciate it. Hopefully my blank stare didn't show through too much on this video. But I know the one of the teams that's come up as they've talked about it heading into the season was some of the Villanova teams. So look back to the 06 Villanova team that lost to Florida in the Elite Eight. They had Randy Foye, Allen Ray, Kyle Lowry, Mike Nardi, so all guards were kind of the three guys that used the most possessions. And they had Will Sheridan inside, who I think was the main big man from that team. But they also had a couple other guys coming off the bench, and Dante Cunningham and Shane Clark, who was more of a wing player, as I recall. So that's probably the best one I can think of. What's amazing to me as I look at this is they actually ranked 16th in adjusted defensive efficiency, which is pretty stunning to me because I'm fairly certain that none of those guards that they started were over 6'4". So my guess is that that's probably it's at least one that I know has already come up with this team a little bit. I mean, they only lost 5 games all season. They shot a lot of threes. They shot almost 40% of their shot attempts from three, made about 38%, and they only shot 44% from 2-point range, which is pretty amazing. One of the key things with them, though, which seems to be in stark contrast to this team, is they were 4th in the nation in offensive turnover rate, which seems somewhat unlikely, I would say, for this team. So I think you look at some of those guys, they just had they made up for that by they didn't necessarily shoot the ball all that well. They shot it reasonably well from 3-point range. They didn't shoot it well from 2-point range. And they really were kind of middle of the pack getting to the free throw line, but they were pretty good offensive rebounders, and they just did not lose the ball. They had a lot of different guys that they could put in that had low turnover rates. All those guards I mentioned were all relatively low, and even the big guys were there. So I guess if there's a team that comes to mind, I guess that would be it. But I do think in addition to the turnover piece, at that point, all of those guys they may have all been seniors. I'm kind of flipping ahead here in Ken Palm to look at that, and all but Nardi of those 3 guards, or of those 4 guards, were seniors at that point, and Sheridan was a junior. So definitely a difference in experience there, as well as the turnover piece. But I guess if I was going to point to one, that's probably the one that I would pick, although I do think they resemble some of the Marquette teams, even when Crean was there, although the wing players they had were a little bit bigger with like Wesley Matthews, and I think that's the same team you were thinking of, actually, Galen, with him and Jarrell McNeil and Dominic James. I mean, but those were a little bit bigger guys who could help more, but they definitely had just role players in the post that they would, kind of count on to go out there, not screw anything up, grab some rebounds, and play defense. So I guess those would be the teams that I would point to, but I'm not sure IU is as experienced, and certainly in the Villanova case as good as those teams were. And I also think the Big Ten just being what it is, and people can say whatever they want about that. I mean, there's still a fair number of big guys there, and it is a more physical league, and I think that eventually takes its toll.
But the point being that a team built on guards and on wings being that successful is a significant outlier, and probably less reliable.
Build on guards and wings and youth all simultaneously. I think that's the outlier. I mean, obviously, I think it's important to have good guard play, but when that's all you've got, that's where the problems really start to come in.
Yeah, and to hit on Andy's point, I mean, if Indiana went from sub 300 in turnover rate to fourth in the country, Galen, would that be enough to keep Tom Crean's job? To hit on your guys' conversation from the episode?
Because I guarantee you, if they're fourth in the country in turnovers, then they've won 27 games. Like, I mean, literally, like they would have. They'd probably score 95 points a game with all the three-pointers they would hit, with all the possessions that they're not wasting due to the turnovers.
Yeah. Hey, I do want to give credit to one of our listeners, Dr. Hoosier, who did Michael Rayome, who did point out Villanova under Jay Wright. They're fine but limited. Also, clearly, Tom Crean is not as well dressed as Jay Wright, so we wouldn't have that going for us. Let me ask you guys a question on defense. Because we talk a lot about
closing in on a similar amount of hair product, though, so we might at least be. He's at least trying to challenge him in that regard.
Yes. We talk a lot about this team offensively because the turnovers stand out as just such a hot button statistic, and it's intriguing what this team can do with Yogi Ferrell and James Blackman Jr. and Troy and Robert. But again, winning comes back to defense, and Indiana, its best teams have always been, I think, fueled by defense. Well, maybe that's not necessarily true, but they've at least been very good defensively, clearly. And Matt over in the YouTube chat asked another good question. He says, do you see a more substantial use of the 2-3 zone or some other type of zone because of the height problem, which is going to lead all IU fans to chuckle? Can we try trapping a little bit, or is this too much of a change? And I guess the point being, is this team so limited just in terms of size and defensive ability that as much as we want to play man-to-man, we're not going to be able to man up, and we need to go to switching defenses, go to gimmick defenses to have a chance? Or, is that just kind of unsustainable on a game-in, game-out basis, and we need, and not really anything to hope for? Andy, what do you think defensively for this team?
Well, I think the problem is that 2-3 zones often make it even tougher to rebound in terms of not having a assigned responsibility on who you're going to get. So, even putting aside what we've all seen in times I use going to zone in these last couple of years, I think that's the other concern is, does that actually exaggerate a weakness that already exists? From a trapping perspective, I guess I would be, if I'm gonna do something other than try to play man-to-man, that to me is what it would be, because one of the things, and I know we tried to talk about this, I think I sent you this question to ask Alex when you're talking about the Canada trip, was how is this team going to speed people up? They want to be able to play faster. Tonight it felt like even Texas Southern, I think Galen, either you or Scott tweeted this out from the Crimson Cast account, that there were, Texas Southern was getting this game to be largely played at their tempo. They got sped up a couple times, but in general, they were able to slow it down. And to me, this team needs to get up and down, create wide open looks in 3-point range. We've seen this team struggle in the half court at times, and they have more options in a penetrate and kick kind of game this season than they did a year ago. But I think this team's still going to be able to do its best work when it's out in transition. So if I'm going to do anything out of the ordinary, to me that probably becomes trying to trap and speed people up a little bit more and leave Perea to hopefully protect the rim at the back end. The issues with that are, one, we don't have a lot of big guards, and in cases where you've got people who are going to be able to see right over top of them and get over it, and two, that puts Perea in a position to potentially pick up fouls trying to be the last line of defense. So I'm not sure that's a great strategy, but of the two that were presented, that's the one that I would go with, because I just don't know that there's much else there. In terms of other defense, I don't think IU's played enough of, they've shown 1-3-1 on occasion, but without Tijon to, man the point of that, it just seems, like a futile attempt at just grasping at straws at that point. So I don't really know. I would love to think that there's a better option for this team to hide some of those weaknesses. I just don't know that any of the ones presented or anything that I can think of doesn't present just as many issues on the other side.
I'm going to assume, because we haven't seen anything other than man-to-man and 2-3 zone so far, that we haven't worked on any other defenses in practice here in the preseason. So I think the big problem with our defense last year, and I think the potential huge problem with it this year, is the lack of an identity. And I think that, it's what I hate about the 2-3 zone, is that we just seem to throw it out there as something else to do. It's not something we're committed to doing. We're not particularly great at it. We haven't been good at it since we started playing it. And the idea that we keep going back to it seems like, okay, we're out of ideas. Let's throw the 2-3 zone at them and see if that does something. And I think that that's a very dangerous thing to get into as a basketball team, particularly if you're young. I'd like to see us playing a lot more pressure man-to-man. I'd like to see us coming up and trying to trap on the wings, or even throwing a little three-quarter court full court pressure out there. We play so many guys anyway. Let's get full amount of physical effort out of them when they're out there on the court, as opposed to this almost sagging man-to-man that we tend to play, or the zone for that matter. I think if we try to play more zone, there's no question that because of the size issues we have some deficiencies, but use the quickness. Use the athletic ability that you have to your advantage. Use the fact that you're trying to run a 10 or 11 deep bench. That's what the coaching staff seems to want to do. You've got all those extra fouls. What's the worst that can happen at that stage? You put them on the line. Well, at least then they're not a guaranteed 2 points down low. Maybe they're just having to earn them from the free throw line. So, yeah, I don't know. I do worry about the defense, and I've actually been a little bit worried in this game, and I was frankly worried about what I saw in the U-Indy game as well. Not so much the Mississippi Valley State game, but in both of those games, it felt like we got lost on defense a lot more than we should be against that level of talent.
Yeah, we got another question about this topic of speeding teams up, and talking about even with a top flight offense, IU couldn't speed up Wisconsin, and it does seem like we've always talked about playing up tempo, talked about speeding teams up. And we can do it in the non-conference schedule and against the lesser teams, but against the better teams, they seem to dictate tempo more than we do. And so my question to you guys, for those of us kind of watching the game, number one, what is the tempo number that Indiana wants to play at? Like, for example, tonight it was 68.4. Like, what's the ideal? What's the goal? And what do you have to do that against the better teams? And why does it seem like Indiana's not always able to do that, Andy?
Yeah, I forget what the number that I threw out at you last year or before when that question was. I think it was in the, I don't know, upper 60s to around 70. I think is when it seemed like there was a tipping point for when they were playing better. I do think, the defense to me is one way to do that, and you may give up some points on the one end, but you're likely going to give those up anyway. But you at least get people playing faster than they want. I think that's one way to do it. To sit back in a zone occasionally, or even the man-to-man that has been played that's not overly aggressive. You don't really force the hand of somebody, and then you just get into those situations. And you get a team like Wisconsin. This is the extreme example, but they hardly send anybody to the offensive glass. They typically don't have any kind of gaudy offensive rebounding numbers, but they do a good, they drop those guys back and they don't let you get out in transition and get those easy baskets. So I think the defense is one way to do that has probably not been explored very much by IU. It's pretty easy to bait some of these, SWAC teams that they're playing into getting that up and down scenario that are just a bit more undisciplined and things like that. But I think they've really struggled to do that, and I think the defense is at least potentially one way to do it. I know they try to run on made baskets and things like that, but there are times even from a possession standpoint on offense where some of these weaves at the top of the key and things like that. You're just spending time to do that if you really want to speed somebody up. I'm not saying go take chuck up a shot off the first pass, but there's times when 15, 20 seconds you waste on the offensive end and don't really do anything isn't doing a lot to speed things up either. It just kind of lets them settle into that that kind of pace.
And Galen, if you're not playing aggressively on defense, aren't you to a certain extent playing into your weakness because you're hoping for a missed shot, and yet if you're not, you're hoping to force, obviously not a good shot, but you're hoping to force a missed one. If you're not a very good rebounding team, aren't you better off trying to be aggressive, force turnovers before the team can even get to the shot?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, if you have to take advantage of certain things on the floor based upon the personnel that you've got. And I think you hit the nail on the head. If you can't rebound effectively, and I think against teams that have athletes, we're not going to be able to do it. How else do you get the ball back? How do you get other teams out of their possessions? Last year's team was kind of a double whammy because not only did we turn the ball over a lot, we didn't really turn our opponents over that much, comparatively speaking. I think we were only like 200th in the country or something like that in forced turnovers per game. And so, I would like to see our pace get up in the 70 to 71 range. That's about 3 possessions more per game than we had last year, but only if we can have a corresponding drop in the number of possessions we lose due to turnovers, or we're picking up additional possessions based upon the fact that we're turning our opponents over more often. And I don't think that you do the latter part of that by sitting back in a passive defense like a 2-3 zone and hoping that they miss shots. I think that's what we're hoping other teams do with us, and I don't think it's going to work on our behalf. I don't see why it would work on the other side of the ball either.
It's fascinating. It's going to be a fascinating season. It's such an interesting team, because there's so much talent on the one hand, and yet it's such a weirdly constructed roster that there's some really glaring weaknesses that even with all the strengths this team has, they've got some fatal flaws that somehow they have to find a way to overcome. So it's going to be fascinating to see if they can do it. And, of course, they've got to start now because Thursday is SMU. As you guys noted on the preseason episode of the Crimson Cast, this is one of Indiana's few opportunities to pick up a somewhat marquee win. I mean, SMU is a top 25 team. There are only a few other opportunities with Pittsburgh, Georgetown, and Louisville on the schedule. So Indiana really has to take advantage of these. And, almost unfortunately, this game is at home, which, even if Indiana wins it, they may not be given credit for. But that's, whatever. We won't worry about that now. Let's just get to the game. Let's go out there. Let's win it somehow. And it will be, of course, made more complicated, more exciting, and more interested by the fact that now we add Stan Robinson, Troy Williams, and Emmett Holt all to the mix. So I don't think anybody really knows what to expect Thursday night because we don't know how this team's going to play against better competition. We don't know how the new guys are going to be woven in. But one thing Indiana basketball always is fascinating. So, and that's why we are here after every game. So with all that said, we could talk about this for hours, but we've already been going for an hour, and it's a weeknight, so we do need to wrap things up. So let's do some final thoughts here. We'll go first to Andy, then over to you, Galen. And Andy, this is your first final thought of the season. So certainly give us a final thought on this game, but even your macro thoughts. We haven't been able to get your kind of big picture on this team, and you've on this show in particular, you've never been known as Mr. Rose-colored glasses. So I'm especially interested to see kind of what you think of the big picture for this team.
Well, I'm first of all, I'm really disappointed. I thought Galen was sitting in for Ryan, and he was going to try to bring Ryan's perspective, like pro-Crean perspective. I'm really looking at how that might shake out. But apparently, you asked him to stay in character, which is fine. But I'm just saying, I was curious to see how that might work. But anyway, I would say, I find myself as I watch the team thinking back to some of the early shows that we did last year and talking about how we really felt like it was going to be a roller coaster, and I find myself with a lot of the same thoughts, albeit for different reasons, as we head into this season. And so, while the team has taken care of business in these exhibitions and things like that, and shown flashes of things that we can get excited about, I think it's also shown, even against lesser competition, that there are clear weaknesses that many of us that were not unforeseen heading into where we're at right now. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how this team reacts to a better opponent in a number of ways. One of those is how they play on the court. The other is just it while it's exciting to play college basketball, I'm sure, I would imagine it's a little bit tough to get too excited for Mississippi Valley State, Texas Southern, and so it is a big game, and I think the atmosphere that'll be there on Thursday night will be really exciting and interesting for these guys to really get jazzed up for it. And so we'll see what happens. I think SMU presents a pretty big challenge in a number of ways, and maybe the best thing IU has going for it is the fact that SMU's playing at 11 o'clock at Gonzaga tonight, and is not a really quick turnaround, but kind of big game for them. Going from Gonzaga to IU pretty quickly will be a fairly fast turnaround for them. But they do have, despite the fact that Emmanuel Mudiay went and played overseas and Marcus Kennedy's out, they still have a lot of talented guys, and a guy like Nick Moore, who I'm really not sure what ended up happening there from a recruiting standpoint with him and IU, and maybe it was a case where he kind of saw himself potentially being behind Yogi and wanted more playing time. But an Indiana kid coming back to Indiana, I'm sure will be motivated as one of their top players, and I think they have a really good chance to expose the flaws that we've seen in this team so far. I certainly hope that's not true, and would love to see an IU victory in that one. But I do think it becomes a tall order. But at least it's our first real litmus test around how good this team might be. And it isn't that they won't get better over the course of the season, and some of those things will certainly change. But it will give us the best idea of what this team is really going to be about. And I continue to come back to the roller coaster, because I think this team will end up getting really hot on some nights and beating some teams that they may not have any business beating. And I think they can be cold on some nights and really get hammered on the glass and lose to some teams that are going to make people want to pull their hair out. So I think it'll be, for us, I guess, to talk about this after games, it will certainly be no shortage of topics, I would guess, because pretty much no matter what, there's going to be some interesting angles about it. But, I'm encouraged by some of the things I've seen so far. I think the backcourt's really strong, and have certainly the perimeter shooting is going to be a huge improvement over last year. But I think anybody who's watched these games and says they feel great about the interior play is definitely kidding themselves. And so it'll be a big test for Perea, because I think what he's shown thus far is improvement, but he's also shown some of those lapses, and I think he's really going to be tested against some of these better teams that IU plays from here on out.
And Galen, since you are filling in for Ryan, please use this opportunity to explain why the Hoosiers will have an X's and O's advantage on Thursday night.
Well, obviously,
sorry, we love you, buddy, but I had to.
If you have the choice between a guy that's won a national title and won, at pretty much every level of basketball, he's obviously going to have a struggle in this game against Tom Crean. So I think that's a good no. Look, I will say this actually, in all fairness, I'm not totally sold on this SMU team. From this perspective, they didn't really play well on the road last year overall. They did win at UConn, but they also lost at Temple. They lost at South Florida. They lost on a neutral court to a pretty bad Houston team. This is not a proven commodity, this SMU squad. I know that they're ranked, but they've still got a lot of pieces that they're trying to make work on a regular basis, and they're relatively young. Nick Moore is a junior, yes, but they've got other guys who are going to be key players for them that are relatively young. And while Larry Brown is obviously an excellent coach, they have to learn to do things that they're not used to doing. And as Andy mentioned, they have a really tough turnaround going. When that game ends tonight, it's going to be 1 o'clock Tuesday our time, and then they play us at 7 o'clock on Thursday, and they have to squeeze a cross-country flight in with that as well. So a lot of
class. These guys go to SMU.
And class, yes, exactly. So a lot of things that they're going to have to deal with, and obviously playing in Assembly Hall is tough for opponents. And I think we're going to come out with a lot of emotion. I think bringing Stan and Troy back into the lineup, that's going to be an emotional boost, I think, for the team. I think that having a big opponent in as opposed to a SWAC team is going to be a big thing. And so I think there's going to be a lot of emotion out there. I think I could see us getting out to a decent-sized early lead. I just wonder if we're going to be able to sustain that throughout. I'm really teetering on whether I think we're going to win the game or not. Like I predicted we were going to lose this game on the podcast that aired yesterday over on Crimson Cast, and I'm still kind of leaning that way, but I definitely see a scenario where we win this game. But I also see a scenario where SMU isn't as good as everybody thinks they are. So,
can we agree on one thing real quick before I give my final thought? And that is just that it's a good thing this team doesn't have Emmanuel Mudiay, because just watching some of his highlight tapes like that, in terms of being as good as advertised, I mean, it's hard to know playing over in China, but he sure seems like a heck of a player, like really good.
It is, and and frankly, it is a huge indictment on college basketball that he's not playing college basketball right now. I mean, that is a case study in what's wrong with the system.
Mm-hmm. And I believe he went to Prime Prep here in Dallas, which,
right.
If you know anything about Prime Prep, I don't think the kids are getting the best direction and the best chance going there. So. Anyway,
it's an academic beacon, I would say, in the darkness. Reaching out for. I don't know. I couldn't even come up with anything to finish that, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, with that said, Galen, I agree with you. I think getting Stan, getting Troy back, having Emmett Holt play his first minutes, we assume that he'll play in his first game. It being the first big game of the season, there have been some lackluster crowds at Assembly Hall, which is not uncommon for early games. But I think, especially a weird start time tonight, this will be the first real chance where we're going to get some answers. Like look, when you do a post-game show after every single game, including exhibition games, admittedly, you stretch for meaning, and you stretch for interesting things to talk about. Because we're talking about these games for an hour afterward, and I do think there have been some worthwhile things to discuss, like how is Honor progressing, and how are the young freshmen doing, and this kind of thing. But look, I mean, we're going to find out more about this team in the first 5 minutes of the SMU game than we've learned in all 160 minutes this team has played in the exhibition games in the first 2 games of the season. Just because of the atmosphere, because of the competition level, because it's the entire roster. Minus Devin Davis, but the entire active roster that we know is going to play this year, all those guys back. So it's so intriguing on a number of levels. And I don't really know what to expect. I do think that this team will put up points, because I think that's the one thing that we've seen is that this team is very capable offensively because of their guards. And outside of that, I have no idea. Hunter Perea could get 2 fouls in the first 5 minutes. One thing I didn't get to tonight that I wanted to say is that despite his 5 blocks, I wonder if that's fool's gold at all, because one thing I've been impressed with him about so far this year is he hasn't really been swiping down and going for blocks when they haven't been there, and he did that a couple times late in the second half after he had gotten 4 or 5 blocks, and he can't do that because we can't afford him getting cheap fouls. So, does he start doing that against better competition? We don't know. So that's why this game against SMU is so intriguing. Plus, it's a huge win. If Indiana can get this win, it really means something, could really mean something for this team come selection time. Not as much as you'd hope because it is at home and we don't get credit for Assembly Hall wins, which is kind of the benefit and the curse of Assembly Hall. But it's still a big opportunity for a young team to gain some confidence against a legitimate opponent, against a more than legitimate coach, and against a team that has some preseason hype. And so we'll see. We're going to find out about this team. Not as much as perhaps you might think, just because there's so many new guys getting in, and I could see Troy and Stan being too keyed up and struggling in the first half because they're a little bit too emotional, that kind of thing. But at least we'll start to get some answers to the many questions that we have about this team. And of course, as soon as the game ends, win or lose, we'll be here for another episode of the Assembly Call. I believe for the first time all season. Just like the real Hoosiers, we will have our full lineup with Andy and Ryan both here. And Galen, before we close out, just want to say thank you to you for jumping on with us tonight. When I know you said on your guys' preseason show, and if you haven't listened to that, do. It's not the most, I will tell you, it's not the most optimistic outlook of the Hoosiers. But frankly, you go to Crimson Cast for realism, not necessarily optimism. And I didn't find myself disagreeing with too much of what they said. A lot of good analysis. I know you guys said you won't be doing as many shows this year, but you will have some of the other guys doing it. So what can we expect from Crimson Cast this season?
I mean, we're gonna probably have at least we're gonna have one weekly show with Michael Rayome and with Michael Petrie and with a couple of other folks kind of floating in and out of the periphery. Tony Adrania hopefully going to be joining us on coverage as well. Some of you may remember Tony from IU Sportcom and from some stuff earlier on with Crimson Cast as well. And Scott and I will still be doing some shows. It'll kind of depend on how things are going, but I think generally. We'll be doing our live shows on Wednesday nights, so be sure to check us out there. And if that changes, just check the Twitter feed. We'll have information for you there. And I appreciate the invite to the show tonight. As always, this was a lot of fun, and you guys do an excellent job. We love listening to you.
Absolutely. And Andy, I know you want to jump in real quick before we sign off.
Yeah. So. Couple quick things. I'm about halfway through the Crimson Cast basketball preview, but I also listen to the weekly rewind of football. So if you're a glutton for punishment like I am and continue to watch these games for reasons known only to you, it's at least a good form of therapy, I find, to be able to listen and talk about it. But the real reason I wanted to jump in outside of that was I know, Jerod, that you and Ryan had talked a little bit about Mike Davis and his return to Assembly Hall tonight. It sounds like he got a nice ovation and kind of held a press conference afterwards, stayed on the court talking to IU fans. I will say that it amazes me and said something about this, kind of in front of my daughter tonight, who has no idea who he is and anything about it, but talked about. I didn't give a ton of background on this situation, but you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who has handled both this situation and leaving and been more appreciative of the opportunity and gracious for everything that was that he had the opportunity to get because of this job. It's been pretty amazing to read the different stories that have been out there about his reaction to coming back and what a fondness he still has for IU in spite of everything. I think it's a good lesson in not only appreciating what you had and an opportunity that was thrust upon him and a lot of other people would have loved to have, and I think he definitely appreciates that and the way that he's handled the whole situation and everything since then, and the positive attitude, I think, is a good lesson for any of us. And no matter what's going on, that here's a guy with every reason to be pretty bitter about the way things ended and the way that some folks treated him on the way out, and nothing but fond memories. So definitely, a nice thing for him to be able to get in and get that ovation and a good, I guess, life lesson, if you will, on how to handle some of these things, because I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who'd handled that situation better than he has.
I agree completely. If you didn't read, I'm sure most people listening to this probably did, but if you didn't read the interviews Mike Davis gave, to Crimson Core and Inside the Hall and Peegs, go read them, because I think you're seeing a man who is so grateful, so appreciative of of the opportunity that he got here. When the way things ended, he really could have been bitter. And I think for a lot of people my age, Mike Davis helped deliver the most memorable 3 weeks of my college career. I still remember that, still think back to that. And if he hadn't taken a really big burden on his shoulders, a big opportunity too, as he will tell you, and as he's still thankful for, that wouldn't have happened. And I think despite how that ended and what happened in subsequent seasons, what he did with that season, with that group of guys, and how they speak about him, I think tells you what you need to know about him. And just from my personal experiences with him, just a great guy. And frankly, there are two ex-IU coaches who deserve big, rousing ovations and deserve to have Hoosier Nation show their love to them. And only one of those coaches so far has gotten it. And frankly, of the two, he's the one I respect more. I'm clearly grateful to the other one for what he brought, but I think just Mike Davis, now he's handled everything. You have to respect him. So, Galen, I don't know if you wanted to chime in on that before we close out, but just
I'll just
be Davis got that.
No, honestly, I was happy that Mike Davis was able to come back as a head coach, and I'm happy that the IU crowd, gave him a nice ovation. And I think it's a wonderful story. And I think you guys summed up the rest of it much better than I could have.
Well, if we're going to impart Dumb and Dumber again, as Andy did, I hate goodbyes. Clearly, it's been very hard to close the show out, but we will, because we've been going on for a while. But we appreciate everybody who is still listening, and there are many of you there. So thank you And be sure to join us Thursday night after Indiana SMU. There's going to be a whole lot of answers to a whole lot of questions. So we will we'll talk about them, and hopefully it's after a win, not a loss. We'll see. Talk to you soon, everybody.